The characteristics of fascism, an introduction. Fascism, as an ideology, has been very difficult for historians and political scientists to categorize, and great debate has ensued in academic circles as to the precise nature of fascism. Hence the misunderstandings, mislabeling, and ultimately the purpose of this essay. A large reason for this is that arguably there is more than one variant of fascism. There is not a unified whole. The historical examples that are looked to in order to explore this topic, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and fascist Spain, while very similar to one another, were ultimately very distinct from one another. These differences can be seen not only in the policies that the regimes pursued, but also likewise in the personalities of the leaders. The most immediate point of distinction between the fascist regimes was the Second World War. Germany, Japan, and Italy were members of the Tripartite Pact and participated, even started, the global conflict. However, fascist Spain remained neutral while the world ravaged itself. Even though Franco had received support very directly from Hitler and Mussolini during the Spanish Civil War, Franco himself remained aloof of the global war. Is that right, Graham? Another point of division can be seen in the topic of religion. Mussolini, as a younger man, claimed to be an atheist and said, quote, "Only idiots believed Bible stories," unquote. Francisco Franco of Spain was a devout Catholic, and Hitler claimed to be a Catholic, yet there is little evidence to support the contention, and many high-ranking Nazi officials were neo-pagans or pantheists. Imperial Japan, on the other hand, had an official state-enforced religion. Yeah. State Shintoism was used to justify the rule of the emperor and of Japanese imperialist aims. Another issue where we see vast discrepancies between the fascist regimes is on the question of race. While they all agreed that certain races were superior to other races, they disagreed on which race was superior, and they disagreed on the issue of anti-Semitism. The Nazis' hatred for the Jews is well documented. Hitler, in his book Mein Kampf, has at least 175 separate mentions of the Jews. Nearly 25% of Hitler's magnum opus is devoted to his hatred for the Jews. The Italian fascist attitude towards the Jews is a bit more complicated. Up until 1937 and 1938, Italian fascists accepted Jews into their ranks. One man named Massimiliano Rava was the president of the Jewish community of Venice and was on the executive board of the Union of Italian Jewish Communities. In the 1930s, Max, as he was known, was a promoter of the Committee of Italians of Jewish Faith, a fascist organization that supported Il Duce. In 1938, quote, PNF members were approximately 26.9% of the entire Jewish adult population having Italian citizenship, unquote. And of a group of chief rabbis, quote, 5 out of 21 were party members, unquote. Fulvio Suvic, the Italian ambassador to the United States, sent a statement to the American Jewish Congress stating that, quote, the Italian government plans no change in the policy towards its Jewish population, whom it regards highly, and that recent attacks against the Jews in the Italian press are not significant of government attitude, unquote. This, of course, was not to last, as in 1938, Italy passed race laws very similar to Nazi Germany's Nuremberg race laws. On November 7, 1938, the regime stripped Italian Jews of their party membership. Many historians have made the argument that Italy was largely following the lead of their bigger brother, Germany. The Italian government did not assist the Nazis in rounding up Jews. In fact, Italy and the territories it occupied became a relative safe haven. Between 1941 and 1943, thousands of Jews fled from Nazi-occupied areas to Italy. The Italian authorities even evacuated some 4,000 Jewish refugees to the Italian mainland. It was not until after the Italians had surrendered in the summer of 1943 that the SS began rounding up Italian Jews, and then not at the behest of the Italian government. Similarly, Spain did not participate in the Nazis' persecution of the Jews, quite the opposite. Quote, during the first half of the war, some 20,000 to 30,000 Jews were given permission to pass through Spain, unquote. The accepting of refugees during the war certainly became a talking point for the Franco regime after 1945. This talking point is undermined, however, by the fact that Franco did provide a list of Jewish families to the Nazi regime in 1941. That being said, this information was not acted upon and did not include the names of the tens of thousands of refugees. And while the Spanish allowed SS officers into the country, the SS were, quote, especially troubled by some Jews who were considered close to leading members of Franco's regime, unquote. While Franco was certainly a monster, some put his estimated death count at around 250,000 people. No debate about that. He did not subscribe to Nazi anti-Semitism. While the racism of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany are well remembered, the racist legacy of Imperial Japan is often overlooked. Historians Hiroshi Fukare and Alice Yang note that, quote, Japan also had a comparable history of creating a system of racial supremacy and racial order to promote nation-state consolidation and national unity. Claims of the supremacy of the Japanese race also justified and facilitated Japan's imperial ventures in Asia, unquote. Imperial Japan engaged in the oppression of the Ainu people, the Ryukyu Kingdom in Okinawa, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, as well as widespread mistreatment of Allied prisoners of war during World War II. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the Japanese Imperial Army forced thousands of Korean women to be sex slaves. Somewhere between 20,000 and 410,000 of these so-called comfort women were abused by the Japanese Army. During the Sino-Japanese War in 1937, when Japanese forces seized the city of Nanking, they began to massacre the population. Encouraged by officers, the Imperial Army murdered at least 200,000 people and raped 20,000 Chinese women. The Japanese military also engaged in human experiments in order to develop biological weapons. Unit 731 experimented on thousands of Koreans and Chinese, some being vivisected while still alive. All of these actions were motivated by Japan's perverse sense of racial hierarchy, buoyed by their Bushido culture. What is fascinating to note is that to this day, the government of Japan denies that these crimes occurred. Japanese textbooks either outright deny that these crimes ever happened, or they minimize the extent of the crimes, or otherwise try to justify it. Even today, Japanese museums often repeat 1930s-era Japanese propaganda to explain why Japan invaded its neighbors. Naoki Hyakuta, a close friend of Prime Minister Abe, and is on the board of governors for the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation, claimed that stories about Nanking were merely U.S. propaganda. Not only are there official denials of war crimes, but racism and xenophobia are endemic to Japanese society. This is all to demonstrate that the various fascist regimes of the 30s and the 40s had varying conceptions of race. These are merely a handful of points of contention between the most historically significant fascist regimes of Europe. There are, of course, other points of division within domestic and foreign policies, economic policies, rhetoric, and ideology. For these reasons, fascism has been very difficult as an ideology for historians and political scientists to generalize or categorize. As Davies and Lynch note, quote, for all the enterprise, for all the time and critical intelligence devoted to the undertaking, we really have very little purchase on understanding fascism, unquote. While it has been difficult to categorize, many who subscribe to the mainstream interpretation do not even acknowledge that the debate exists. Many have observed that fascism tends to distance itself from ideological shackles, and oftentimes it contradicts itself. As will be discussed later in this essay, fascism prides itself on action and deeds rather than words and reason. This has been observed by historians and political scientists, and has even been stated by the fascists themselves. Giovanni Gentile, a key Italian fascist thinker, wrote, quote, "Fascism is not a philosophy, much less is it a religion. It is not even a political theory, which may be stated in a series of formulae. The significance of fascism is not to be grasped on the special theses which it, from time to time, assumes. When, on occasion, it has announced a program, a goal, a concept to be realized in action, fascism has not hesitated to abandon them, when in practice these were found to be inadequate or inconsistent with the principle of fascism." Unquote. This hesitancy to commit to an ideological line is another reason why the ideology has been hard to categorize. Another aspect of fascism that makes it difficult to categorize is directly connected to its tendency to contradict itself. Historians and political scientists have observed that fascism tended to borrow policies and ideas from other ideologies, even from ideologies the fascists swore blood oaths against. There were, quote, "multifaceted influences of liberalism, Marxism, syndicalism, socialism, Catholicism, nationalism on their ideology," unquote. This tendency was even observed during the time period when Mussolini and Hitler came to power. However, just because they borrowed ideas and policies does not mean that fascism has no point of view of itself. As Benito Mussolini wrote, quote, "that a new doctrine should use the still vital elements of other doctrines is perfectly logical. No doctrine is born quite new, shining, never before seen. No doctrine can boast of an absolute originality," unquote. There are a number of reasons it is difficult to categorize fascism, let alone to pin down ideological precepts upon it. The fascist regimes were very different from one another. Fascism as a movement tended to eschew ideological consistency, and of course they borrowed heavily from other ideologies and ideas. Despite these difficulties, one can still categorize it, despite the inconsistencies and borrowed ideas. Fascism itself is nevertheless a distinct ideology, with its own ideas and doctrines that ought to be analyzed. As Mussolini wrote, quote, "Fascism is today clearly defined not only as a regime but as a doctrine. It has been unequivocal point of view of its own, a criterion, and hence an aim, in face of all the material and intellectual problems which oppress the people of the world," unquote. By looking at the writings of fascists, we can find that, quote, "unequivocal point of view," unquote, that Mussolini speaks of. The various fascisms have several shared commonalities that can be used to establish the unequivocal point of view of the ideology. Among the characteristics are an emphasis on nationalism, unity, populism, militarism, social control, totalitarianism, anti-liberalism, anti-democracy, anti-free markets, action, and of course, terroristic violence to enforce their will. While it is relatively simple to sparse out these characteristics as distinct from one another for the convenience of a list, one must remember that often these characteristics blend together in a holistic fashion. What is interesting, however, is that often these characteristics and the ways in which they were implemented further lead to difficulty in categorization. Fascism represents an eclectic and often contradictory blend, quote, "which sought to use nationalist myths to mobilize the masses in a spirit which was both reactionary and revolutionary, traditionalist and modernizing, elitist and populist," unquote. All this being said, one cannot take the words of dictators and ideologues entirely seriously. As David Renton writes, quote, "It would be a mistake to take the language of political figures at face value. The formal pronouncements of any leaders should be weighed against their practice," unquote. Renton is entirely correct. So not only will this essay look at the writings of these fascist ideologues as well as the actions of the fascist dictatorships.